Good morning, Rutgers students. This is Dr. Christopher Young, and we're here today to discuss relativism. Up until today, we have been discussing principles related to decision making. We've looked at utilitarianism and how we make a decision based upon our passions and how that decision can benefit a group of people, where we maximize the moral good or the moral satisfaction or the satisfaction. We looked at deontological ethics, or how certain actions are wrong or right based upon the intrinsic value of that action. We discussed Kant and Ross, particularly Kant's categorical imperative and Kant's idea of intuitionism. We also discussed egoism, focusing particularly on Rand and her view of egoism, also known as objectivism, and not to be confused with objectivists. What we're going to look at today is a group of people, or an idea, an ideology, which suggests that Bentham and Mill in utilitarianism, Kant and Ross in deontological ethics, and even Ayn Rand are all incorrect. And this body of research and this body of writing on relativism suggests that there is no right or wrong, actions or outcome, and everything is relative to the community in which a moral code is considered. And that certain groups of people or certain cultures all have their own moral systems, and therefore one moral code is not better than another. Now there's some individuals who quickly jump to this and say that's right. Then there's a group of people out there, such as myself, who I tend to consider myself an objectivist. Again, objectivist, not to be confused with objectivism. I tend to think that there is truth across all cultures. So just to put it out there, one of the things that we tend to emphasize in this course is that this idea of relativism, although we want to understand it, I am not going to provide you the opportunity to use it to make a moral argument. And the reason I'm not going to do this is because you'll see as we get through this lecture, there's lots of problems with relativism. And it tends to push us or gives us an out when it comes to trying to find truth in some type of moral idea. So first, let's just jump in to what is relativism. Well, as your book suggested, and your book was written about, different cultures have different moral codes. And relativists claim that ethics are relative to the individuals, groups, cultures, and society in which they are included. So relativism resists universal moral norms. And what we'll see throughout the lecture, in addition to the video that I provide at the end from Jonathan Haidt, most people or many philosophers believe that there is some type of moral code or moral norm that cuts across all societies. Immanuel Kant, Ross, all agree with that premise as well. Arguably, Bentham and Mill and Rand have probably a little bit of a different view, though Rand, one can quickly look at her and say she has a moral code, and that moral code relates to self-interest. So we'll unpack this as we move forward. So cultural relativism, the question we want to ask is, why is this behavior a problem for ethics? Perhaps that question should read, why is cultural relativism a problem for ethics? Well, there's three main challenges to cultural relativism. Number one is persuaded people to be skeptical about ethics. It challenges our belief in some type of objectivity or universality of moral truth. But more important, it almost stops us from seeking some type of truth. And what they also suggest is that there's only various cultural codes, no more. So rather than seeking the common denominator that cuts across humanity, cultural relativists say there is none, and therefore this idea of moral systems is incorrect. And I tend to find this very challenging, especially in the business community, especially when we're so far into globalization and the integration of firms across different cultures, groups, populations, classes, that it's important for us to seek some type of moral truth or objective truth so that we can create a common system where businesses can operate effectively. So let's just pick 6 or so beliefs of cultural relativists. Different societies have different codes, they suggest. The moral code of an individual society or a small culture decides what is right and wrong. An action is right and wrong only based upon the morals of that society. There is no objective standard to argue one's culture's ethic versus another. It also suggests that one culture has no special status when compared to others, and that we should always tolerate the cultures of others. So it's a very forgiving idea, which is everybody and anyone can be right based upon their small group. And we'll see that there's real problems with this as we move forward. So let's start with James Rachel's and the Eskimo culture. James Rachel's wrote a paper on moral objectivism where he was taking a different position to the relativists such as Ruth Benedict. And he uses the example of the Eskimo culture. And if you look at the culture and some of their actions, on the face, they appear to be very different than most cultures, particularly those in the West, such as the U.S. In particular, men had more than one wife. Men would share their wives with guests as a means of hospitality. Killing of children at birth was acceptable. Female babies were killed more often than male babies. So most relativists would quickly jump to this and say, this is the morals of that society, and therefore relativism is correct, because clearly the Eskimos are not immoral. So Rachel's looks at this and he says, okay, I understand your argument, but perhaps you're not going far enough. And this is the problem with relativism. What Rachel's is trying to find is rather than just looking at on the surface of a group's actions, look a little deeper. Look at the foundation of the action, the reason why they're doing it. And what he found by looking at the Eskimo population is, first, he found life is very hard. It's a hunting and gathering population. He found that in this environment, males were hunters and died often in the hunt. So therefore, the need for male children was very important. He also recognized that in certain years, in certain seasons, the hunt would be good. And when the hunt was good, they had enough food for everyone. But in years where the hunt was not so good, they had to kill their children in order for the elder kids to survive, in order to further the species. Sort of sounds a little bit like Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene, which we discussed last class. The reason that female babies' lives were taken more than male babies was for the notion, or for the idea, that males were killed more often on the hunt, and therefore you needed a greater population of males at birth than you did females. Hence, if in fact children were to be, their lives were to be taken for the group, they were going to take the females rather than the males. But what he found out also is that this taking the life of a child was not an easy thing for a parent to do. It wasn't as though that this was an action that was without pain, and that many of the Eskimo children had a greater care for their children, and because they had such a great care for their children and the lives of all of them, that they unfortunately had to spare a few. So he's trying to suggest, or he is suggesting, that there is an objectivist claim running through the Eskimo population, and that is that we care for our children. All populations care for their children, the love for their children. They care for the existence or the future existence of the population. They care for their husbands. They care and provide hospitality. So the simple idea, although his argument is not simple, so I'm not trying to discredit it, but the simple idea that comes out of Rachel's is that we have to go much further when looking at moral claims. We can't just look at the action itself, but we actually have to go further than that and try to understand the reason for the action. So cutting across the Eskimos, he clearly believes that there is an objectivist claim, that the Western society, perhaps, and the Eskimo culture is the same. We have the same truths. How we get there may be a little different. And what I'm going to plead for throughout this course is, in the U.S., we definitely have a different moral system than perhaps in the East. If we were focused on China or India or Vietnam or Japan, the way we engage our culture is definitely different, probably even more different than the Middle East, probably just as different in the African continent and all the nations that we tend to engage with. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, rather than just looking at the actions, the different actions, try to find a common objective purpose between all cultures. I was in China most recently, and clearly I noticed different cultures, different cultural actions, different ways that the culture engages with their parents and in business. But that didn't mean it was any different than the U.S. When I looked at it again, I clearly see very common themes running through the Chinese culture, similar to the U.S. culture, such as the love for the family, the love for a community. But not to get off topic, my whole point is I'm trying to find those common objective truths and trying to see, although the actions might differ in how we engage with culture, the morals may differ, or at least the appearance of morals may differ, but the underlying objective goal appears to be the same. Other examples in your reading that you see is female genital mutilation, or this concept of excision. On the surface, and I'm not taking any position on this, because clearly this has some very ugly outcomes. But there's certain populations that believe that female genital mutilation is a good thing to do. On the surface of this action, it seems very violent. It seems though kids, young females, just prior to puberty, are in great danger of health issues. There's a lot of pain. There's a lot of suffering. But if we go further than that, we go deeper than that action, there is an objective claim to this. And the objective claim is that certain populations really care about their females. They hold them to high esteem. They look at the female population as being pure, and by doing this, it removes or it's assumed, not sure if true, but it's assumed to be that by engaging in genital mutilation, that it takes away a woman's desire for sexual actions with others. Again, I'm not going to take a position on it, but the general objectivist claim is the purity of the woman, the care for the woman. Eating the dead, as you also seen in your reading, is that certain populations eat the dead. Now, for us here in the West, we would probably look at that and say that's that's immoral, or the action is vile, and that might be true to us. But there is some objectivist claim, such as when you eat part of the dead. It's not as though we're talking about eating the entire body, but when you eat part of the dead, in some cultures you're releasing the soul of the dead. Other cultures, that soul or the body becomes part of you, and you take on part of that spirit. Again, it's more of an objectivist claim of respect. Eating pets or incest, or two other ideas that were in your writing or in your readings. I won't go into either of those, but again, I want you to think about different moral actions and see if, in fact, we can find an objectivist claim throughout them. So the problem here, let's talk about the first problem with a relativist claim. It doesn't help us solve anything. If I have one group that believes this is right, or this action is right, and I have another group that believes this action is right, if everything's relative, you can never prove truth. You can never make an argument. As you know, it's very hard to prove anything, but we can make rational, logical arguments. And this idea of relativism never takes this into consideration. So that's the first. Relativists just argue that there's no need. Hence, there's no need for ethics whatsoever. So here's the responses to relativism. Again, these come right from your book. The first one is it true? Is this idea of relativism true? And when you most of us, when you think back, you tend to ask yourself, is there any things there's things that I do that are innate to me, innate to society, innate to people? Is there certain things that cut across all cultures, all groups of us, that is common, such as we shouldn't kill each other, or to care for individuals, to care for the dying. So there's a couple to throw out there. So the very first response is, real simply, trying to get at our emotions. Is this true? The second, which I find to be the most important to me, is that relativism is self-defeating. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you want to say or use relativism and say, well, we can't prove, or we cannot make an argument that cultures have different moral codes. If we can't make an argument that there's such a thing as right and wrong, well, then we can't suggest that somebody's actions are more right. What does that mean? Well, the first and second class, we talked a little bit about Nazi Germany. And we talked a little bit about Nazi Germany, particularly with utilitarianism. And most of us would probably agree that I hope all of us would agree that the Nazi regime was an evil regime. We're doing things, taking the lives of the Jewish population, the non-Protestant population, homosexual population, and the list goes on. Take the lives of these individuals because it potentially added to the good or the greater of society, particularly the Nazi society. Well, if relativism is true, then we can't argue that what the Nazis were doing was incorrect. But clearly all of us are taking position that the Nazis were doing some really bad things. So if we're going to make an argument that they're doing something wrong, what do we use that? How do we come up with that that argument. So we start to see that relativism breaks down. Because if we can't argue that something's wrong, we can't argue that something's right. I could look at other people, such as Martin Luther King, who we've discussed in the class. If relativism is true, then you can't say that what Martin Luther King did was right. Because Martin Luther King was fighting for equal rights and freedoms for the African American population, particularly in the southeast of the United States, and then across, obviously, all of the United States. So if relativism is true, what he was doing was incorrect because he was going against the moral code, the moral ideas, the acceptance, the social contract in the South that it was okay to oppress the African American population. So really what we're saying here is a cultural relativist cannot criticize another society for being intolerant because they are following a cultural norm. Same with slave owners, genocide, and because of this, relativism cannot work. And I already mentioned this, but it discounts positive change. Again, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, the idea of slavery. If relativism was true, then slavery should be accepted. If relativism was true, then Nazis should be accepted. If relativism was true, fill in the blanks. Keep going with that. And I find that to be probably the best, at least in my opinion, the best argument against relativism. Another argument, silly argument, but fun, is that if everything is relative, now unpack that, everything is relative, which means there's no truth. So if we say that everything is relative, everything is an absolute claim. So therefore it defeats the relativism on the face of it. So if everything is relative is an absolute claim, then simply relativism cannot exist. So it defeats itself mainly on the face of the argument. So I think I may have said to you in the first class, I've been spending time looking at diversity, and I want to make an argument that diversity has something to do with relativism, because when we're in a diverse society, we have different groups, different populations, different cultures, all of whom have their own idea or their own identity. And my research starts in the social sciences. I spend a lot of time looking at how people engage with cultural goods. I spend most of my time looking at religious goods. But I'm now trying to take my preliminary research on religious goods and bring it into the business world. So let me walk you through the very basic tenets of my research, some of my early findings, and then I'll explain to you how I think this may work with the business community and how this may engage with relativism. So on your screen, you have a simple graph, two-variable graph. On the left axis, you have a violation of a duty. So that's one thing I'm going to track, and I'll tell you exactly what that is. And on the X, we have a diversification of culture. So let me tell you what I'm looking at here. I wanted to see if diversity had anything to do with the change in a person's adherence to a duty. So I started by looking at the Christian population in each state of the U.S. So I looked at each individual state, such as New Jersey, New York, California, Utah, and I used something called the Herfindahl Index. Now, I'm not going to bother you with the details of it, but what the Herfindahl Index shows me is the level of religious diversity in the state. And I only focused on the Christian population. I wanted to first see if that was an effect. So I looked at all of the Christians in each of the states, and I tried to find out how diverse were the religious beliefs. So, for instance, in Utah, a very large portion of the Christian population are Mormon. If I look in the South, such as in Louisiana, a substantial portion of the population is Southern Baptist. If I look at Maryland, fair amount of Catholics, also a fair amount of Mormons. I look at New Jersey, very diverse. California, very diverse. And what I did here is I took diversity, and I wanted to also understand levels of suicide. So why suicide? Well, across all Christian faiths, suicide is considered a duty, or not taking one's life, including your own, is considered a duty, and it's a violation of the religious duties. So I wanted to see if diversification had any impact on this, had any impact on taking one's life. Now again, I'm just going to go back to why diversity. Well, I'm thinking that in a very diverse society, there's lots of people engaging, talking, each having their own viewpoint. And when I'm in a society where there's all of these different cultures arguing with each other or having debate with each other what's true, that this whole concept of truth might go away. We become a relativist society, right? Because we can't agree. And my initial hypothesis going in was the more diverse a population, the greater the bad behavior, or in our case here, the more there will be a violation of a duty, or the more suicide there will be. So what you see on the screen here, this is not the actual data, but it's a depiction of what the data looks like. And you can see there's not 50 X's. Again, I did this just to show you what the basic idea of the outcome is. And what I found, what I initially thought going in, was that as the diversification of religion increases within society, that the violation of a duty would go up, meaning there would be more suicide. And I first tried to understand this on a linear fashion. So I fitted some data. You guys are familiar with regression. So I fitted a data line, a linear trend line to my data. It was statistically significant. About 72% of the change in suicide had to do with the change in diversity, or the increase in diversity within a state. I controlled for a whole bunch of things. GDP, urbanization, sunlight, you name it, I controlled for it. And I looked at this and I said, wow, that's pretty much what I thought would occur. But then I looked at it again. I spoke with some econometrician friends of mine, and they said, yeah, maybe it makes sense to look at this a little differently. Maybe it's not really upward sloping to the right. It looks like maybe there's a U-shaped in there. And so I then tested it using a parabolic trend. And what I found is that there was a statistically significant trend there as well. And that orange line that you see on your screen represents exactly that. That represents this parabolic line, and it fits the data better than my linear trend line. All right, so what does this mean? For those of you in the class that are, you struggle with statistics, what does this mean? Well, what this is suggesting is that over here to the left, when there's very limited diversification within a society, we have greater levels of suicide. When we have great levels or higher levels of diversification or different religions in society, we have more suicide. And it also suggests is that somewhere within our culture is a state or states with populations or with levels of diversity that optimize the level of suicide. All right, so where am I going with this? Diversity, according to the way I'm looking at the data, clearly has an impact and may have an impact of eroding our belief in duties. Well, what does this mean over here when there's no diversification? Well, this is interesting too. Is when there's no diversification or limited diversification, take the state of Utah where there's a substantial Mormon population. Well, we know that in the state of Utah, which was actually much higher than this one. It's the highest in the country, where they have a high level of suicide, and it's the least diverse. Now, we can, and I don't want to just jump to conclusions, but my thinking is that people in that state take their lives more often than others is because they have no out. Let's just assume for a second that we're talking about somebody that is homosexual, who perhaps is also, or it's an action that is also a duty against Christian faith. Let's just assume that to be true, at least for most Christian faiths. What's their options? They're in a state, they're in a society where everybody's Mormon. Do they see an out? It's very, very heavy-handed faith, and because they don't see things getting better, they may take their own life. So duties are eroded here in some capacity, and duties are eroded or crowded out here. All right, so how does this relate to the business environment, and where is my research going? When I studied for my MBA in the late 1990s, when I did my PhD in the mid-2000s and late 2000s, 2007, 2008, I read all the research very similar to you, which says that diversity within the workforce is good and everybody should seek diversity. And I agree with that. But I guess my question now is too little diversity bad, and is too much diversity not optimal? Is there a point inside a society or inside of our companies where diversity optimizes outcome? Now, that's to be discussed another day, but that's my original thinking going in, is that there's definitely some type of, there's some area, some kind of area, which is what I'm seeking to see when diversity is maximized. And if diversity can be maximized, then possibly we can remove bad actions. All right, so let's just bring this all together. To my far left here, this would be a society. This would be a society of absolutism. All right, there's absolute claim within that society of a duty or of an action. Over here, I have a relativist claim. More diversification, limited ability to agree. Therefore, I now have relativism over here. Somewhere between absolutism and relativism is an area of truth. What I like about this too, this idea, this premise, is that this sounds like, it feels to me like an Aristotelian belief, the golden mean, if you will, which we talked about in class. Okay, so typically in class we're going to spend a few minutes talking about this moral relativism mini case. I'll try to get to this next class or the beginning of next class. But what I would like you to do is spend time and watch a video, a TED video of a gentleman by the name of Jonathan Haidt. I mentioned Jonathan Haidt in the very first class. You'll see some of the things in his video here that I've already briefly touched upon. But what I like about Jonathan Haidt's talk is Jonathan is an objectivist. I'm not sure if he actually says he's an objectivist, but he's finding or looking for moral objectivity throughout society. And he finds this general notion that we have four moral claims, or what he calls, we have this the foundation of the moral mind. And as part of this moral mind, we have 5 things that we're born with, that's innate to us. And it's based upon our upbringing on how those 5 claims change or are altered. So what I'm going to ask you to do, we're about 35 or 40 minutes into the lecture. I'm going to ask you to spend the next 20 minutes or so watching Jonathan Haidt's video. And we're now at the point in the class where you want to start to bring together some of the concepts that we've been discussing, bring together utilitarianism, deontological ethics, egoism, relativism, and the basic idea of morality, the concepts of Leviathan and Jonathan Hobbes. I want you to start to create your own view on how decisions are made, the importance of decision making. And I want you to start to think about objectivists and the objectivist claim that there is a moral truth that runs through all cultures. We're going to spend a good portion of our class going forward using these concepts, using these ideas. So I'm going to encourage you to start thinking about that and starting to integrate these concepts into one idea, one framework that is yours and yours only. All right, so I'm going to pause this now. I'm going to ask you to watch Jonathan's video, and I will see you all next Monday. We will pick up on the calendar exactly where we should be. So make sure you pay careful attention to the calendar, and I'll see you all next Monday.